Our panel is titled Alternative Data for Investing. It will be moderated by Ben Rudin. He's the commercial business lead at Orbital Insight. Our panelists are Tilky Xu, Vice President Quant Research Data Scientist at JPMorgan, James Bell, the head of AI and machine learning at Dow Jones, Rajeev Sambyal, he's the Director of Data Science, Advanced Digital Solutions at State Street, Nico Smuts, Investment Data Scientist at Investec Asset Management, and Hongfei Li, Co-Head of Analytics at Point72 Asset Management. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Great. Thanks for joining me. I feel privileged to be on a panel with this group, so thank you. So the topic today is alternative data for investing. I'm sure we've heard this topic before. So we've spent some time going over questions that we think are most relevant today. The space is continuously moving, so we want to pick up on topics that we think will be interesting, and the goal here is everybody to learn something new today. So to start, if we could just go through the line, give a quick introduction. If you want to start.
Hi, so I'm Nico. I am an investment data scientist at Investec. We're a fund manager, global fund manager in London. Now, what being an investment data scientist entails for me is I sit on the desk with the portfolio managers and I use data science to generate alpha and improve the investment process. We use alternative data throughout the firm, mostly as a decision support tool for our fundamental analysts and portfolio managers, and it also features heavily in our ESG function.
Hi, my name is Rajiv. Just a quick correction. I'm no longer with State Street. I'm actually with BNY. Folks in BNY are going to have a heart attack if I was announced at State Street. So I'm currently with BNY. This is my second or third week over there. Before that, I was with State Street, where my team looked at some alternative data sets and how we could generate some insights for portfolio managers, risk teams. So a lot of our research and development was centered around that.
Yeah, I'm Hongfei. I'm leading a data science team in marketing intelligence department at Point72. Prior to that, I worked in IBM Watson Research. I built a data science team developing the research asset and bring to the market. And at Point72, we work on a variety of alternative data sets, and we have strong belief for the future of alternative data.
Hi, I'm Tilky, still with JPMorgan. And joined the bank 4 years ago and started on the consumer side doing lots of sort of like credit card transaction data analysis and moved on to the investment side recently. And then in our company, not just our team, but at a company level, we do use lots of alternative data for either buy side or sell side analysis and produce good research. And then we also provide good roadmap and guideline on alternative data strategy and how to set up your data science team and how to integrate the sort of insights into the investment process.
Hello, everyone. My name is James Bell. I'm the head of AI and machine learning for Dow Jones, a professional information business. That's the part of the business that sells data. So I'm here as a representative of a vendor. I'm not part of a data science team. I'm in the strategic side of the company, building new products and services. My background is in Big Four consulting. I was a senior manager at one of the Big Four. Prior to that, I was the IT manager of an investment bank. For us, alternative data, well, we basically sell one of the oldest types of alternative data, that is news data, for use in both high-frequency trading, quant-style trading, but also in the more long-term analytical sense through our DNA product.
And my name is Ben Rudin. I'm a commercial business lead at Orbital Insight. Been one of the early employees at the firm. Orbital Insight's the leading location analytics company in the industry. What we do is we work with satellite data. We don't own the satellites. We partner with satellite companies. We extract information from there. We work with cell phone location data. We're working with connected car data, so really aggregating the supply chain. We're made up of computer vision engineers, data scientists that work with this data, normalize it, and then the output is through a platform we have called Orbital Insight Go. Allows you to circle anywhere in the world and run a time series with the algorithms we've exposed to others. So that's what I do. And now getting to the most important stuff. Let's get into the questions. So getting right into it, I think we all like to hear real life examples. We'll see how real life we can get here. But we'd love to hear real life examples of successes and failures of using alternative data. Nico, maybe you could touch it from a fixed income angle to diversify a little bit. But I know everyone's eager to hear, so please divulge what you may.
Sure. My background is in equities, and I'm sure a lot of the alternative data examples we hear are from the equity space. But I recently did a project for a fixed income team where our emerging market fixed income team, they cover about 60 markets, which means there's usually an election every month somewhere in the universe. And elections are a pretty big thing for sovereign fixed income in particular. And you don't want to get that wrong. So anyone who's been following the news in Argentina, the bond market has taken an extreme beating because of a recent election result. And the problem in emerging markets is oftentimes you don't have as much polling data available, and the quality is just not as high as what we're used to in developed markets. So we developed a tool that uses locally sourced alternative data. I do realize I sound a bit like an organic farmer when I talk about locally sourced, but it's very important to get the data that is representative of what the individuals in the various countries are thinking. And we essentially developed some proxies for voter intentions and then collaborated them into a dashboard that the portfolio managers can use. And we found that usually it gives us kind of a similar insight to what the polls would give us, but it's faster moving, and when there's blackout periods or odd results in the polls, this gives us something that we can still rely on. So unfortunately, the one drawback of the tool is it doesn't tell us when an election's going to be rigged. So if you have any insights there, please, I'm all ears.
Yeah, so one of the projects which we recently worked on centered around news analytics, a lot to do with, I'm pretty sure a lot of people these days are working. You see a lot of startups with news or sentiment analysis and things like that. So it actually spanned both fixed income and equities, not specifically equities or fixed income, but the whole premise was that to figure out or actually pull out some signals from the news data, which typically are not priced in yet, right? Generally, if you have the structured data, typically everything is priced in the security. Like by the time you get the news, it's available. So I think what we did was we pulled different sources of data. We didn't use social. There's a whole legal issue to that thing, ethical and legal issue to that thing, but it was more about pure content which is generated from different news providers, and actually use some of that data. So that was a good. I think we were able to put together a good product on that. And there've been a lot of failures. If I start failures, it'll be a long list. Obviously, with big data and all the issues which come with it. So we have had a lot of failures with that also. But this is definitely one thing which we did. It took us some time, but I think we got there.
So at Point72, we are a research team focused on the fundamental research, analyze the data to infer the business growth. We did make a great progress on either both on the breadth of the analysis and also on the depth. So from the breadth perspective, we developed a scalable solution. For example, the top line revenue using the credit card transaction data, so that we can increase the coverage of the tickers of the business, and so we can increase the utility of our services. And also, in addition to that, we also deep dive of the business using the data we have. For example, we can analyze the customer shopping behaviors, to analyze the market share, the competitive analysis. That's all the things we can derive or make the inference using our data. So that's some progress we also made using the alternative data. In terms of failures, as I mentioned, we are a research team. That's a typical thing happening for research. We need to build a better, maybe more efficient process to get a quick turnaround to demonstrate the value of our research to support more trading decisions for the long short. So that's some lessons we learned through the process.
I will probably give an example. When I was on the consumer side, we have like 6 million consumers with Chase. And we have like 3 years of their transaction data. So the task is trying to use their transaction history to predict in which neighborhood what type of business will be sort of like trending. So essentially, if we so the problem with small business to get credit or loans is like they don't have like a good history or record to prove they're good. But if you can actually use the transaction data from the customer's behavior, and then we also have like where they actually transacted in that specific neighborhood, you can actually build a history or a list of attributes which can help you to predict what type of restaurant and what kind of neighborhood will actually thrive. And that information could actually complement the process when our sort of like loan officers evaluating small business loans, and I thought it's different from investment, but I think it's like a good sort of like example of how we use like totally sort of like orthogonal data to complement a business process.
So it's funny to think of the news as being anything other than a traditional data set, but alternative data can be a traditional data set used in an alternative way. One example I would give is we had a micro hedge fund that had, they wanted to optimize their portfolio for their asset allocation, and what they did was they pulled a very specific set of companies' data looking for things like acquisitions and mergers, and built a real-time sentiment engine, alerting engine, to tell them how they should be placing their assets and how they should be placing their business. And that enabled them to actually, on their simulations, score much better than they were doing previously, be able to be a bit more granular in their movements. So that was a real success. We have so many in lots of different ways. The news is an enormous corpus that's very wide and very deep. And so pretty much any use case you can think of for chasing some sort of signal out of human psychological activity, which is what the news contains, is available to be drawn out if you know the questions you want to ask.
Great, thanks. In the spirit of coming out of the gates quick, let's keep it going. So what are some of the most exciting data sets out there today? You've referred to your Moneyball concept, but James, you want to start from that way and come back?
Yeah, if we look at data sets outside of news, I'm a big fan of satellite data. I ran a project for the Irish Revenue Service who wanted to be able to send everyone one tax bill to pay back the EU, but they don't have postcodes in Ireland, or didn't back then, so they had no idea where everyone lived. And they came to us with 12 sources of data that they couldn't join together. And this is a good example of when applying an alternative data set can actually help you find a signal in the original data sets that you had. So what we did was we applied satellite data about where all the houses in Ireland were, and that enabled us to actually draw a thread through all of these sources of information the government knew to be able to send everyone one particular tax bill. And so consequently, I'm a big fan of satellite-based alternative data.
Myself, I think at our company, small experiments, what we're doing, we're actually collecting the sort of like the screenshot of like traders' eye gaze on the monitor. So if that could be sort of like collected and then successfully processed, essentially using those kind of image data to build an algorithm which reflects how like a trader make decisions, which I think is like a perfect example of how you apply data science or machine learning technology / still sort of like capture the decision, sort of like the experience that is sort of like accumulated by that trader with his experience. I think if that were successful, I would be excited to see more of such data being collected, because I know in Bridgewater, Ray Dalio records all the sort of management meetings and talks, and I think his goal is to build an engine which can actually not replace, but sort of like mimics good decision making. And I think at our firm, we're like doing small scale things like that. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. They are all exciting data sources. But I was thinking there's another dimension to look into the excitement. Even from the traditional data set, everybody uses credit card transaction data. So the question is that what other exciting applications we can derive from the data? So that's another dimension that can drive the innovation. That's also what we encourage the research team to think about. What kind of scenarios, what kind of KPIs we can capture from the fundamental perspective using the alternative data. And also another way to think about is that for one company, if it covers by multiple data sets, how can we stitch everything together and then provide to enhance our confidence, to enhance the insights of the business? That's something can make us very excited.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not. Whenever I have time, I go on Kaggle. If you really want to find interesting data sets, go on Kaggle or go on Google or something. You'll find like crazy amounts of data sets over there. But it's crazy. You should, if you have time, just look through it, and you would have not imagined that those data sets exist. But I think you're right that it's not the data sets, it's the application of it. So I'll give you an example that on supply chain, if you look at it, like it's a very dry data set, right? So you don't think that there's going to be a lot of like insights into it and all that. So a couple of years ago, we did some work with supply chain data, and it's amazing like what that data set can actually bring back to you, right? You apply some of the models on top of it, and the insights it gives you are just tremendous on the whole supply chain, right? A lot of research which comes out, which you would have seen in news or in research papers, that how Apple's, somebody in China is doing some work, and the factory closed, and how that impacts Apple's bottom line and things like that. It's amazing what that data can give you. So ultimately, it's how you apply that data set. I think that's what matters.
To echo what James said earlier, the alternative data can also be using existing, more structured data in a new way. So an example how we're doing that is a big focus currently in one of the projects I'm working on is internal data. So as investment firms, we generate a lot of data every day, and most of it just gets discarded or it sits on a server somewhere. But we've turned our attention inwards and done some in-depth analysis on how we behave in terms of what the analysts do, how they rank companies and potential investments, our portfolio management decisions, and by really looking at that data through various different lenses, it gave us a great way of figuring out what we're good at and where we struggle, what our biases are. And it was fascinating to see when you plot it visually, there are some countries and some regions where we're just constantly bullish, and others where we're just too bearish. And using independent, raw, objective data to hold the mirror up to yourself and improve your behavior as an investor is extremely valuable. So we're quite excited about that project, and it's something that's kind of been quite transformative in the way we think about research and portfolio management.
I think that's really interesting. People always talk about going out and finding that unicorn data set that's going to give you the real edge, and you find out you've been sitting on it the entire time, and it's actually the data sets you already have if you actually analyze them well. I think that's really interesting.
Yep.
Great. Yeah. So we've talked about successes, failures, cool new data sets or ones you already have. Why don't we kind of transition a little bit to the process? So can you explain the process of onboarding these data sets, and also maybe merge with that question, groups that don't have such big firms or may not have the resources to do the whole data science internally? When should maybe someone think about outsourcing? Should they think about outsourcing? Any kind of insight for the audience you may have? We can kind of merge those two questions. Yeah, feel free, whoever.
I can start. So I think typically what I have seen is that getting a data set or data source becomes a DIY project. It's like, everyone starts their own thing, and next thing you know, on a laptop or on a machine, you have this 10, 20 gigs of data all of a sudden, and then people start doing analysis and all. Maybe some experiments, it's fine, but these are not if it's an open data set, maybe that's fine, but it's not a scalable solution, especially if you really want to play with alternative data sets, right? So you need to have the proper pipeline, right, process to be able to get the data set, reconcile it, right, clean it up. Because I think the biggest challenge, I'm pretty sure most of you have seen or come across, is first getting to see the source of the data, right? Like, where is that data, how clean it is, right? Can you actually use it? I mean, we have come across data sets wherein, in case of some vendors also, where the data sets they gave us, we were not able to use them because of some legal implications. So I think it's essential that you first, before you actually pull together a data set, see the source of the data set, then the cleaning process of it, right? Then you need to ingest it, then you need to reconcile it, and then you need to be able to search it, right? So this whole pipeline, right? I think for smaller data sets, again, coming back to the Kaggle example, maybe you download a Kaggle data set and do it on your machine, that's fine. But if you are looking to do some research on an enterprise-wide scale and generate some value, whether it's your PM teams or risk teams or any other thing, right? So you need to make sure you have the right tools and processes set to it, and to add with the data privacy part of it, right? How can you actually, if you're collecting some social data or things like that, where is the data privacy part in it? So I think all of these need to be weaved in before you can actually bring the data in and start using it.
Yeah, I think that's how, if you're trying to decide which data sets should we buy out of, you're looking at 50 data sets, one of them is perhaps the one that you want. How do you determine that? Is you plug them into these pipelines, and I have seen success where there's been two main pipelines. One is a kind of, what we call in the Big Four, a phase zero, a data quality assessment, where you're profiling the data to find out its completeness and trying to judge it on a set of scoring criteria that you can come up with to say, this is how long it's going to take from buying that data to actually using it to generate value. And you can then challenge data sets against each other and go, well, we should buy this one because the value is going to be obtained quicker. But the other pipeline is about compliance. Data sets could be sold by everyone. There's 25,000 or so databases being flogged around. Some of them have real important legal and compliance issues, and you need to have experts looking at that. Because the last thing you want to do is integrate a data set and then find out you're in trouble for insider information. So you've got to have that kind of value judgment when you're bringing it on board as well. So I always think of those two pipelines as specialist and separate. And after you've done the data quality assessment, you can start running some sort of MVP test algorithms to see if it's going to start answering the sort of questions that hopefully you've collated. Hopefully you've built a sort of question service in your company where you're saying, what are the questions that you want us to answer, and we'll go and get the data to do it. And you could draw those together into groups, and then you will know which data set to invest in because you are answering enough questions and you're getting a very high score back on the data quality.
I want to echo what James mentioned. So I can describe the high-level process at Point72. When we get the data sourcing, we start with identifying the data source. And then we get the compliance approval. This is very important at Point72. We always set up the very high standard to follow the regulatory requirement that can help us to build a sustainable business for the long term. So that's a critical part. And then the third step is the POC, run the POC. So we have the platform team support to test the data ingestion. We have the data science team to run the backtesting framework. Of course, we need to identify the use cases to run the backtesting, to check the data quality, model quality, all kinds of matrices. And then the last step is make a decision. We need to talk to our trading team, investment team, to understand the utility, the value, and then make a decision. So this is kind of the process, the pipeline running in the firm.
And to build on that, I feel like at each point, you actually require different subject matter expertise. I think for onboarding and all the technical part, it's more really like technical people who are good at that, but like say data sourcing, you probably want to leverage subject matter expertise who actually have lots of knowledge about that specific business. And in our company, sometimes we will even hire people directly from like vendor, and then they will actually be the best person, experts, knows what type of data to get. And then move on to the next step. Once we got like a few sets of competitive vendor, how do we really evaluate which one will act to the signal? So that's kind of like my job, is to actually compare which data set actually give additional performance in terms of like influence. And what I realized the best is because when vendors sell you data, there's also the incentive. They want to sort of like not make it clear that clear how they process it, and then they want probably aggregated it in a sense you can get sort of like a better signal, but that could potentially introduce bias or overfitting. So our job is actually to figure out, is that data really going to give us real signal in the market when it's like really sort of like being tested on real data. So what we would like to do is actually how we evaluate it, we will find the closest of what we want within our internal data set, and then we know how we process that, and then benchmark against the signal that we hopefully trying to extract from additional data sources from the vendor, and then map that into like real revenue terms, and that's how we evaluate. And then we will make decision based on what will be the potential estimate real revenue for the firm, and then decide is that worth to purchase this vendor or not.
Ben, I think the second part of which you were asking about when it's a smaller organization, what do you do, right? So it just occurred to me, and at least I've run into this issue a lot, wherein like as data scientists or engineers, right, you have the tendency, or we have the tendency to be scrappy, right? So you scrape the data from here, scrape the data from here, put together something and roll it out, right? I think that is like dangerous, or I mean you can still do it, that's fine, but I would rather, even whether it's a smaller organization or a bigger organization, I think just to spread out the risk a little. I think if you have vendors like Dow Jones or S&P and all this Quandl, right? Because at least you know the sources of data, the vendors, right? So it's more to spread out the risk and easier, because that's not your core strength to pull the data from here and there. So you're better off actually relying on the vendors to actually, I think it's not a smaller organization or bigger organization. So you just have to pick and choose, like, what is your strength? Like, can you get that data internally? Like a lot of portfolio data for a lot of financial institutions, like you don't need to source the data, right? So that data is internal, but if you are looking for alternative data and it's not your core strength, you're better off actually sourcing it, unless until you want to make a business in it.
Great, thank you. So when budgeting for an alternative data source, what's the necessary ROI that you're looking for? And is it that straightforward? Or, we'd love to hear you kind of elaborate on that, what you're looking for, because, we all have budgets and there's a lot of data sets out there.
I'm pretty sure there's some financial controller sitting in the audience and going, oh, wow, this is a budget thing. It's challenging. At least as consumers of the data, everything is about cost and the value you generate out of it. So the way, at least I look at it, or we have looked at it in the past, is unless and until it's a pure R&D shop where you just start with the data first and then figure out the issue, which at least I have never done, or I haven't come across the situation, because you always have a business problem, and then you're trying to figure out, okay, how do you actually put together the data set around it, right? So if you have a business problem, chances are you would know the business value of it. So I think if you have a business problem, you have defined the business value of it, it's easy to get budget for it or get it budgeted, right? But if you're just collecting all the data first and then figuring out how to put together a problem for it, so first of all, I don't think you're going to go anywhere with that. And the second thing is, if you get money for that, I would love to join your organization, because typically no one has given me data where money where I've gone in and so give me a couple of $1 million. I want to pull together some data and define a business problem. So that's how it is.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that when you're comparing a number of different data sets together, the data quality assessment is really leading you to an assessment of the vendor themselves. So that's a big part of, is the vendor going to be delivering the data in a reliable method? Is an archive going back? Is it accurate? Does your data quality assessment throw up that this is just being tagged using machine learning and no humans have looked at it? And I think that once you have that kind of assessment, then that's another half of the question, and that will enable your financial controller to be able to just plug it into his mathematics to say, well, which one is going to answer these questions quicker? Which one is going to still be here in 5 months' time? And in the past, it was you had to go hunting down these data sets, and it was difficult to find them, and you needed to convince people who perhaps have some data but they didn't realize its value and they don't even have it set as a product to sell. These days it's flipped entirely around, and people are coming to you with data sets of all sorts of exhaust from all sorts of alternate systems and sensors and so forth, and you've got to ask yourself, well, how quickly can we integrate this into our workflow and answer the questions that we need to answer? And that cost is a definable number that you can compare different options against.
Yeah, so we measure the return based on the utility. So we derive the research, deliver the research solutions to our investment team. We measure the performance or the value of the data set based on how many tickers we can cover, how many teams can use our solutions, and how often do they use our solutions. So that's the utility metrics we use to measure the return.
I'm particularly interested in this question. Maybe that's why I'm asking. But coming from my seat, I've been in this situation where if it's a newer data set or getting to know a prospect, they may want to use ground truth to validate another data source. So in that regard, what do you use for ground truth when assessing a new data source?
So in my experience, the holy grail is when you find some sort of a data point that maps directly to an item on a company's income statement or balance sheet. A great example is I once scraped data from the deeds registry where real estate transactions are registered, and plotted or used that data to estimate what a particular property developer, how many condos they registered over the last 3 months. And it was amazing to scrape that number and see that exact number pop up a few weeks later in the income statement. Now, that happens very rarely. So in the absence of that, it becomes a problem, I suppose, of correlation and estimation. And I think Richard's example earlier in his talk about how they use McDonald's footfall data, it's all about finding out, does this correlation exist? How robust is it? If it's not good at predicting the level of sales, for instance, is it good at predicting the delta, or at least the direction of change, or some inflection point? So in reality, we live in a world without ground truth in many cases. So you have to essentially kick the tires and see how robust it is at getting you 1 or 2 steps closer to where you ultimately want to be.
Or at times you probably don't have ground truth, and then you can't really truthfully checking if it's at the exact level every day. What you can do is maybe you don't need the exact ground truth, but that signal has to be consistently generating the signal consistently and to predict other kind of metric. So as long as this feedback is consistent and captured by a model, you can think about the data you were given is essentially some kind of function of ground truth, as long as that function is not random. So that is a reasonably good data source, because in the end, that could be translated into another inverse function in the model. So I think the requirement is as long as that source is consistent within itself, not random or extremely noisy, and then that could potentially give your sort of prediction some value. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that when you're trying to find, it depends on the data set, the alternate data set. Some data sets have a very short shelf life and no archive. You can't run simulations, you can't run backtesting. And there you're kind of sort of feeling around in the dark a bit. But I think that what you were suggesting, where you go and speak to your SMEs, if you can find an SME that's willing to say the data predicts better than I do, best of luck to you. But if you can find yourself an SME, maybe they are the people who have a bit of insight from their vast experience that made them an SME to be able to, suggest out of multiple data sets which one is perhaps the got close to a ground truth, following the maxim that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. There is no true ground truth, unless we're dealing with satellite data, of course.
Right, so we have a similar experience. So because we are running the fundamental research, usually we capture the KPIs if we can find from the earning report. That will be the great use cases. So we can use that as the ground truth, either to map to the top line revenue or maybe the customer traffic using the satellite image data. So that's a ground truth we can rely on. But on the other hand, just as I also mentioned, so we have in many scenarios, we just deep dive into the analysis, the customer shopping behaviors. How do we know how people shop in different companies or different stores? The way we work is with our insights team. So that's how we structure the organization. Not only we have data science team, we also have a research analyst team. They have more fundamental research background, the fundamental background. So we work with them closely to ensure that every signal we generate, every trends, every model we generate, that consistent with their thought process. So just for example, like maybe AAA some food safety issue, or we see a big drop of the transactions. There's no ground truth. Nobody tells us what's the impact, but we show this trend to our analysts. They can help us to identify or just cross-check if that makes sense or not. So that's usually how we work within this organization.
Great. A lot of times, yeah, I mean, alt data is used to generate alpha. I mean, sometimes it's for risk management, et cetera. But on the topic of alpha, and then we'll start going to some other topics, can you go into detail how you determine if there is alpha, as well as what tools you may use to make this determination?
I think, I hope no one from BNY is here. They're going to kill me if I disclose this information. So, I'm pretty sure most of you know around alpha. There is a story, I think it was around 2016, a reporter in Louisiana reported, she tweeted actually, that one of the refineries was on fire. I believe it's 2016 or 2017 somewhere, right? So a couple of institutions actually caught that, and they were able to obviously, trade in there, and the futures they traded in there, and they were able to obviously make money in there. And by the time the mainstream media caught that, right, it was like, again, a couple of hours later, so the futures did rise up. So any petroleum-based products, because it was one of the, I think, top 10 or top 20 refineries, a refinery that size catching a fire would mean that the futures would get impacted, the byproducts of oil and petroleum, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that there is absolutely, with alternative data sets, you can actually, if you mine those properly enough, right, you can generate alpha. So just imagine that whosoever caught this one tweet, they were like, at that moment, there must be thousands of tweets generated in that day, and probably there'll be a million tweets generated. To be able to actually hone in on that tweet, catch that at that instant, and actually trade on that is just amazing. So whosoever built that system is really good. So yeah, there are definitely strategies and tools and data available which you can use to mine that and generate alpha. How you do that, and it's proprietary most of the times, but if you source the right data, you can reduce the noise. I think it comes back to the question we had earlier about how do you get these data sets and how do you build the pipelines around those data sets. I think these couple of things are very, very critical. Otherwise, you can collect all the data in the world, but you won't be able to make anything out of it, right? If your pipelines are not proper, if you cannot reduce the noise, you cannot hone in on the value that data is bringing you. So it's not about like different sets of data or how crazy that data set is. It's basically the meaning or the value you derive out of data set. I think that's what generates alpha.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I can only speak for my team. So we are running the fundamental research. We deliver signals and solutions to our investment team. So the investment team, they pick up the ball and then keep rolling and then generate alpha. So we really, my team rely on them to generate the utility. So this is how we work together. So. Yeah.
At Investec, we have a pretty robust suite of backtesting tools to see whether any signal that we get from whether it's internal data, structured data, alternative data, we run it through the whole backtesting suite. And alpha potential is not a single number. It's really how the signal behaves. So we try to create a 360-degree view. We have a fairly comprehensive dashboard to see how the signal behaves during different time periods, how it behaves relative to other signals, what are the cross correlations. Sometimes you find a great signal, but it kind of does the same thing some other signal is already doing, and you essentially double counting the same signal. There's so many different ways in which a signal can stop working, and we try to reason about and investigate all of those in advance. And when you do eventually bring it into production, you have to prepare yourself for some sort of alpha decay, because out-of-sample performance is never as good as backtesting.
Great. Switching topics slightly, shifting. ESG, it's topical, and particularly in Europe. You have the Investec Carbon Fund. If you'd like to elaborate on the role of alternative data, ESG, what you're seeing. Yeah.
Sure. Alternative data is really applicable to ESG because, to a large extent, it's never been particularly well documented, well captured how well companies perform on various ESG metrics. So when you want to develop an ESG strategy or implement that into your existing strategies, alternative data is really helpful. So 2 examples. We recently launched this fund, which it's called the Global Environment Fund, and it's essentially focused on decarbonization. So we use alternative data to calculate the full carbon footprint of each company that we consider, their carbon footprint across the value chain. So not just what they disclose, but going up using supply chain data to essentially look at the cumulative carbon footprint going all the way up the value chain. And often that can be multiples of what a company discloses. And our research has shown that companies that reduce this number, that either do carbon offset or essentially carbon replacement in some way, tend to outperform over the long run. And this alternative data has allowed us to go to kind of the 3rd generation of ESG investing. First generation was exclusion and divestment. Generation 2 was engagement. And now we can do positive inclusion. We can allocate more money to companies that are doing really well on ESG. But it's how you measure that that's really difficult. So alternative data has been extremely useful for us on that front. Another one, as you mentioned, it's not always all about alpha. For us as investors, particularly in fixed income, we're fiduciaries, and we represent our investors, and they expect us to do the right thing on their behalf. So when we invest in government bonds, we engage with those governments, and we want to make sure they're held to account. And we have a collaboration with the World Wildlife Fund, who interestingly sit on a lot of great satellite data that they've shared with us that we can use to track deforestation. And when countries commit to stopping deforestation, not allocating mining licenses in protected areas, etc., and they don't deliver, we can verify that using the satellite data and hold them to account.
Yeah, I've seen, I've worked with a company who are scoring in ESG, and I think one of the important things is there is no standard yet for this score. It's kind of like on a company-by-company basis. But what they're doing is they take the announcement and the pricing of the corporation, and then in the future, there's another announcement, and between it, they're applying the news as a timeline across that to see if that accounts for some of the price fluctuations into their algorithms. And I think that ESG at the beginning was kind of like thought of as maybe something just millennials are interested in, and the millennials are now 30 and putting their kids through college. It's not going anywhere. But what it highlights and what it's turning into is that it's a score of how well the company is run. Right? If they've got a really rotten ESG score, then you've just basically seen behind the curtain, as it is for the Wizard of Oz, running the company. How well is it actually run? That G part of the ESG, the governance, is vital when you're judging about where you should be placing your money. So I think it's a very exciting area, and it's going to continue taking off, I'm sure of it.
No, I think just to add on to what James was saying, right? So at State Street, so there's a huge push around ESG, especially with on the asset management sides. People want to see, the asset owners want to see where their money is going, where is it invested. It's a huge, huge thing now. So we actually ended up, I think as just mentioned, there's no central score, there's no central authority yet which says, okay, these are your ESG scores. At State Street, we ended up developing our ESG scores and giving it to the portfolio, saying, okay, this is the ESG score for your portfolio based on some of the data which we ingested from there. But it is absolutely very become very relevant to Nico's point that asset owners want to see how are we investing the money in in industries or companies which are producing a lot of polluting the environment or polluting the atmosphere. So it's become a very, very relevant issue now.
Great. I think Tilky or Hongfei, this is a question you guys suggested, which is really a terrific question for the academics or the younger folks out here, which is everybody, of course. What skill sets do you recommend, do you need to evaluate these data sets and therefore get hired by people like yourselves? So people in that mindset and that want to share with their friends or their kids or any themselves, you can elaborate.
I can start because we currently have intensive recruiting so far. I've met a lot of candidates. So I would recommend for the new candidates, you need to have the full, think about the data scientist position in the asset management firm. You need a full spectrum of the skill set, starting from how do we identify the problem? What problem, what's the right problem you want to solve? So that means you need to have certain business background to identify the problem. Then collect the data, clean the data, process data. Just make sure whatever you want to plug into your fancy model, you don't put garbage in. So usually we spend a lot of time for the cleaning, processing data, and then build a rigorous backtesting framework. So the modeling skills, that's critical, that's very important. And then you need to deliver your solution. You need to interpret your result to your users. So that means communication skills is also very important. And think about the whole full spectrum, the end-to-end solution. It's not only one specific major covers statistics or computer science. Yes, of course, that's the major expertise, but still think about the every components in this full spectrum. That's very important. On the other hand, I would recommend, especially for students, just get yourself familiar with the real world data. It's never like your homework data. It's so clean, this is so nice. But the real world is so messy, so noisy. You need to have the right expectation what you are going to face outside of school. And the last thing, but also most very important, is the passion. Think about if you want to find signals from the massive data. It's just like find the needle in the haystack. You need passion. You need to be enthusiastic to look into the data, the massive data, dirty data, to find the signals. So that's all the attributes I look for from the candidates.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. A couple of years ago, or maybe not couple, but maybe 9 years ago, it was extremely hard to find people coming out of the college and start working on machine learning and those kind of things. So these days, even the interns who come in, they've worked on PyTorch, TensorFlow, you name it. They've already worked on it, right? So I think from the technology side of things, it's basically they are up to speed, right? But the challenge is that, as Hongfei was saying, is I think the focus is still on like data science or machine learning is just building a model. It's not, right? It's not that you take like a couple of like documents or text or build a model around it. It's a solution, right? So I think that solution engineering thinking, it's not that you need to be a solution engineer, but at least you need to have the full picture in your mind. Okay, what are you building? Like it's just not a quick model you are throwing, right? So you need to have the full picture in mind when you're doing something. So that's highly important, that you need to clean the data. I think a lot of people forget that the first phase of building a model is actually getting the data and cleaning the data to make it available for the model, right? It's just not that you have everything ready and you start building the model. And I think that's what I feel a lot of interns which we get are people who come straight out of the college do not have that rigor into or have the patience, to be able to do that. I think that's highly important, I think.
Okay.
Just to add on, I guess how I get into the door, get a job is this stats background, economic background, finance background, coding. That's what you get into the door. But how make you perform better than other people is you have to be very open-minded and just absorb learning and then willing to, because especially in big company, it's you don't just talk to your quant whatever team colleagues. You have to work with product dev, subject matter expertise, report to senior people, and also talk to traders and stuff like that. So I think those are just be open-minded and be patient, and then sometimes you're coming from a different background, and then you need to educate. So I think that's what I learned on the job is to be, I guess, persistent and then be very open-minded, and then you can always learn. And but the hard skill set, I think it probably takes at least a few years to build the coding, the math, and then the stats. But yeah, but I think the bigger part is how to sort of absorb quickly in the environment and trying to understand how to solve the real problem, as they said. Yeah.
When I was hiring data scientists, what I'd be mainly looking for, because a knowledge of statistics and being able to code and the sort of things that you get at university was table stakes, really. What I'd be looking for is an intense curiosity for how to solve problems in imaginative ways. And I think that the investing world is a bit of a challenge. It's a bit of a PR battle against the sort of big tech, Facebook and Google, which seems very cool and interesting. But for me, I think that when you're a data scientist in the investing world, you're actually at the sharper end of the mathematics. You'll get involved in a lot wider sets of information than you would do if you were just working out recommendation engines for search engines and things like that. So the soft skills can't be underplayed. The ability, as you say, to be able to talk and go out and convince people, particularly people who don't understand the first thing about data science, to invest in these sort of data sets, that can't be underestimated. So it's your extracurriculars, it's your tenacity. Those were the things I'd always be looking at, because everyone was coming in to the Big Four with excellent grades. It was those extras that made the difference.
Super helpful. So for the last few minutes, we'd love to open it up to the floor for any questions. Do we have a mic up?
Hi.
Next. Yeah. No, go. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Thanks. Sorry about that. Hi. Very interesting first. But I have a question regarding, in the beginning of the talk, the panel, you talked about how difficult is it to onboard a new data source, a new alternative data source, and how we can measure that and then finally price it. However, on the other side, you have thousands and thousands of different data sources out there and different provider, different, a lot of different data. How can you, and how can you choose? How can you define which one is relevant for you? I'm sure that you guys have plenty of vendors coming knocking on your door. How would you make the decision? Seems you have thousands of different data sources and different vendors, and you can only onboard, a couple. How would you do that?
Okay, I'll take it. I think part of the answer is in your question when you were saying that a lot of vendors are coming and that's showing the data and all. I think if you know the data you're looking for, most of the times you actually know what you're looking for, right? So when the vendors are actually giving you the data or they're showing the data with the source of it and the quality of it. So those are a couple of key parameters you have to measure first of all, like the source of it, the quality of it, how good it is, and how does it play in the data set you are looking for, right? So I think if you have those initial few criteria, you know that what data set you need. And typically, if you're working on a business problem, or you're looking to find some data sets, there are some known data sets, right? Even with alternative data, even though it's very wide and spread, but you still have a fairly good understanding of what data you want to bring in. So I think as long as, again, it comes back to your business problem or the problem you're trying to solve. I think if you have a good handle on it, you can narrow it down to a couple of vendors and a couple of data sets which you need. Because I think you have to remember that bringing in, again, going back to what we were discussing earlier, it's not 1,000 data sets, it's the 10 data sets and the value you're driving out of it. I think you have to just balance this thing out. That's my perspective.
Yeah. We usually start with the use cases, or what's our roadmap if we want to build up the product or solution. So for example, for the next 3 months or for the next half a year, we want to build a new ecosystem, maybe restaurant. Then this is our use case. Then what data can support the restaurant? What do we want to capture? What KPIs will be relevant for restaurant? Then think about what data sources can be supportive to those KPIs in this ecosystem. So this is how we start our process. So.
And I just want to add to it. So when you start, right, typically you start with few data sets, and as you build your business problem or your solution, I think you will see that it's not that you have to get all the data sets in the beginning. That's why it's important those pipeline concept comes in, that once you have built that, so later on as you're evolving the solution, you will be able to ingest a lot more data sets and you will know what you're looking for.
And I will say, always understand your problem first and try to use as much internal resource or what you have, without thinking about the buying, whatever, because that really helps you understand the problem. And then you will come up with hypothesis. It's not like you got a news data and then something pops up and then a signal. It's usually what signal are you looking for. Then you get those specific alternative data that cannot be provided by your internal data. Then you code it up, you backtest, and trying to see, hey, I test my hypothesis, and I was looking for this signal. Does this data source give me that particular signal, especially consistently, and it improves on top of what I already have? Because it kind of does not make sense, without really understand what you're interested to solve, and then just go get a satellite image, data. It doesn't go that way. You really have to use what your existing resource and understand the problem very clearly in your head. Then you go to some vendor and then you compare them, and that really narrows down the set to quite a bit. Yeah, and then you probably need to leverage subject matter expertise in those signal extracting process, like computer vision or NLP. Those type of experts come in. Yeah.
You're going to put Ben out of business. Don't use satellite data.
We have other data sets.
Hi. My question is regarding the ESG part, and I totally understand it's becoming more and more important for the asset managers. And I also know the problem. There are no specific one standard which all the banks or all the companies can follow. So are you aware of any work in progress standards which has been currently happening? Because at some point, as you mentioned, State Street developed its own, but as an investor, if I want to compare what is it across the banks, how can I do? So are you aware of any standards which are still in progress?
I think there's a UN group that were working hard on standards, but as I understand, the members of that group, once they had defined it, then went into starting their own startups based off of that standard. So there isn't yet a global universal standard, but the UN did actually work quite hard on defining some. It's a kind of still a work in progress, and some of these companies are trying to leverage that relationship with people off that team that they can then push their way of doing things to become the standard. So it's a little bit the Wild West. It is quite early in the process, but it is being worked on. And I think that's happening across the whole of AI and machine learning, right? Everyone's worried about ethical standards to do with machine learning, and people are starting to build global standards. I know the EU is running a pilot at the moment on ethical AI development. So that's going to be a really big thing, and the feedback from that is actually going to steer the European Union's defined standard and ISO standard.
We have time for one more question.
You guys have mentioned how backtesting is key to actually understanding the value of the data. Have you seen a difference between how that backtesting timeline takes depending on the data type? So analyzing satellite data, computer vision analysis, analyzing news, NLP analysis, analyzing numeric data is a different type of analysis. And that requires different resources, different sort of approaches. So can you speak to that? How, because the alternative data brings basically opens up a cornucopia of like options, but it also implies that it stresses the process by requiring personnel and new approaches. Could you guys speak to that, please?
I'll fill that one. So when we do our backtesting, we backtest the signal. And so where that signal comes from is kind of irrelevant. And it's really how long it takes to get to that signal. So if you have satellite data and you need to run a convolutional neural network to do image recognition, and that extends the pre-processing stage essentially and the signal extraction stage. But once you've extracted your signal, then the backtesting is relatively quick. And often what we backtest is lots of different variations of that signal. Are we interested in the level of the signal? Is it the delta? Is it the log delta? Is it the smooth average? Is it an exponential moving average? There are so many variations. And once you have the signal, it's relatively quick. But it's, the complexity of the data and the size of the data set can really slow down, especially the quality check as well, before you even get started on the signal extraction.
And just quickly to add to Nico, so I remember one instance. So this particular case was especially around text. We were trying to do some backtesting with our portfolio returns and some content. So we actually had to go back and backtest, I think, like 6 different time periods because of the variation or volatility in there. So it was extremely hard to actually give us the right backtesting results, which tied in with our predictions. So it's I think as Nico was mentioning, it's once you hone in on that signal, I think then you know that where you have to actually change the parameters and things like that. But it is a time-consuming process, and it really needs a lot of patience to. It's not very straightforward that you get this data set and you just backtest for the last like 2 months or 3 months and you're going to get results. So it's a huge trial and error sometimes to figure out the right time window for that too.
All right, thank you so much to our panelists.